The world she was sold into was one of hunger and order. A place where every breath had a purpose, and every mistake carried a price. The plantations stretched for miles, their boundaries marked not by fences but by fear. The air hung heavy with dust and cotton fiber, and the sun showed no mercy to those who bent beneath it. In that land, life was measured not in years but in harvests. The stronger you were, the longer you lasted. The weaker you became, the sooner your name faded from memory. They said the economy ran on cotton. But beneath that white gold was the true currency of the South, human labor. The bodies that tilled, carried, bled, and birthed without rest. The ledgers told a story of profit, but between their lines lay something far colder, a system built to turn people into numbers, and numbers into wealth. The woman who was bought for 6 cents had no place in those calculations. Her condition made her unwanted, a burden even among the enslaved. Yet on that day, she became an entry in a book, a figure of trade, a possession signed and sealed by another man's hand. The man who purchased her was not of wealth or stature. He was a smallholder, a man used to working beside his own slaves, his palms calloused, his clothes worn by labor. He had never owned more than 2 field hands. He did not come to the auction seeking another. But that day, something drew him to the sound of the auctioneer's voice. Some say it was pity. Others say it was greed. History does not tell. What it remembers is the number, 6 cents, and the fact that he paid it without hesitation. When he took her away, the crowd laughed. They mocked the price, the man, and the woman whose worth had been decided in less time than it took for the ink to dry. Yet he walked away in silence, his new purchase following behind, barefoot on the dirt road. Each step she took left a faint mark in the soil, soon lost to the wind. No one there could have known that the story of those steps would outlive the laughter that followed them. The road to the plantation was long and uneven. The fields she passed were endless, lines of green and gold broken only by the dark silhouettes of men and women bent to their work. Every few miles, she saw a face that looked like hers, tired, cautious, and trained not to meet the gaze of those who rode past. In that silence, she began to understand her place. A new master, a new home, a new uncertainty. The only constant was the child she carried, whose faint movements reminded her that she was still alive. The records say little about what happened in the weeks that followed. Only fragments remain, an entry for supplies, a mention of a delivery, a note about a woman, of weak condition. But in the absence of written words, the land itself remembers. The rows of cotton, the small wooden cabin by the edge of the field, the worn path leading from the quarters to the big house, all held traces of her existence. Each morning, she rose before the light touched the horizon. She worked where she was told, spoke when she was spoken to, and moved with the quiet rhythm of survival. Yet even in obedience, she carried something the records could never erase, a will that refused to surrender completely. She spoke softly to the child growing within her, whispering stories of places she would never see again. To her master, she was labor. To the mistress, she was a shadow, tolerated but distrusted. The house was small, but in it lived the full weight of a divided world. Every glance, every silence, every task held a meaning deeper than words. The mistress saw a woman who reminded her of the broken order of things, of how easily one life could blur into another. The master saw a life he had bought, yet could not command completely. And the woman, caught between them, lived each day knowing that her mere existence threatened the fragile balance of their home. The months passed. The child grew. The whispers in the quarters began to spread, about the woman who cost less than a loaf of bread, about the strange way her master avoided her gaze, about the silence that filled the air whenever her name was mentioned. She heard them all, but she never spoke back. There was nothing she could say that would change what she already knew, that her life had become a story written by others, a story in which she played no part except to endure. Yet endurance has its own power. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the fields were still and the world seemed almost gentle, she would rest her hand upon her belly and listen. The child moved, steady and certain, as if reminding her that there was still something pure left to protect. In that moment, she was more than what she had been made to be. She was a mother, and for a brief heartbeat of time, that was enough. 6 cents could not buy a loaf of bread, yet on one scorching day, it bought a woman's entire life. In the heart of Alabama, where the soil was red and the air carried the weight of labor, every corner of the land was shaped by the hunger for profit. Cotton was king, but its throne was built upon the backs of men and women whose names were never written, whose stories were bartered like tools passed from one hand to another. Across the South, the price of a body shifted like the seasons. A strong field hand could sell for hundreds, a young woman, skilled in housework, for less, and those marked by age, weakness, or motherhood were reduced to numbers too small to speak aloud. The markets in Montgomery, Mobile, and Selma were filled with such reckonings. Planters came with ledgers and silver coins, comparing muscle, teeth, and obedience the way merchants judged crops. Each entry in those books was a sentence of ownership, binding flesh to land. In that world, value was dictated not by humanity but by utility. Men were weighed for endurance, women for fertility, children for potential. To give birth was to multiply wealth, and the same womb that suffered under pain became a tool of profit. The records of the time spoke plainly. One woman, aged 23, with child, reduced to half value. One boy, 12, strong shoulders, high rate. Such words filled pages that still survive, fragile but unashamed of their cruelty. The county where our story lies was small, almost forgotten even then. It sat between two rivers that carried cotton bales to larger ports, its fields dotted with cabins and smoke rising from distant fires. Those who lived there moved by a rhythm set not by time but by command. The sound of overseers' horns marked the beginning of labor, and the fading light signaled its end. When night fell, songs rose softly from the quarters, songs not of joy, but of endurance, meant to keep hope alive through the darkness. To own people was not seen as wrong, it was seen as necessary. The wealth of the South depended on it. Banks offered credit for slaves as they would for land, and fortunes were built upon bodies that never rested. In this trade, compassion had no place. A woman heavy with child was not spared but discounted, her coming burden seen as wasted labor until the child was old enough to work. And so, when the woman sold for 6 cents was led away from that market, no one questioned it. The logic of the time made it possible, even ordinary. Alabama's sun watched over all of it, the endless fields, the whitewashed houses, the rows of wagons carrying bales to the river. Beneath that same sun, the woman walked, her body both a vessel and a verdict. She was one of thousands who lived unseen, yet her story endures because of that impossible number written beside her name. 6 cents. It was a mistake to the clerk who recorded it, perhaps. Or perhaps it was deliberate, a reflection of how little she mattered in a world where lives were measured by yield. Yet that small price held more meaning than the men who paid it could ever understand. It revealed the truth of their empire, that the wealth of the South rested on a moral debt it could never repay. Every acre of land, every bolt of cotton, every coin that passed from one hand to another carried a trace of someone's life within it. And in the forgotten county where this story took place, the earth itself seemed to know, holding the memory of those footsteps that once pressed into its soil and the child that stirred beneath the skin of the woman who cost less than a meal. The morning of the sale began long before the sun appeared. The air was thick, holding the scent of dust and sweat, as if the ground itself had been awake all night waiting for the day's transactions. Wagons creaked along the narrow road toward the yard, carrying men in wide hats and women who sat beside them in silence. The voices of traders rose and fell like a market of grain and livestock, each word carrying a price, each glance measuring worth. When the first light touched the roofs of the stalls, the auction began. The auctioneer stood at the center, coat loosened, face already wet with sweat. His voice cut through the murmurs like a whip, calling names that did not belong to the people who bore them. One by one they were brought forward, bodies turned this way and that, teeth shone, shoulders felt, questions asked and answered by others. Some of the crowd came for strong backs, others for soft hands. They looked for workers, housemaids, cooks, whatever could serve their homes or their fields. Each bid carried a story, each sale closed a life. Then came her turn. She was led to the front without resistance, her head bowed, her steps small and even. The sun caught the edges of her dress, revealing the outline of her swollen belly. A murmur spread through the crowd. The auctioneer paused, then smirked, his tone turning almost playful as he announced her condition. He called it a complication, a fault, something that reduced her value. Laughter followed, cruel and brief. He asked who would take a woman already burdened, whose body was promised to another life before it could serve another master. No one spoke at first. The silence stretched. Men shifted, women looked away. The auctioneer tried again, lowering the number, then again, his voice dripping with mockery. A life inside a life, he said, 2 for the price of 1, and still the crowd held back. To buy her meant waiting months before she could work. It meant feeding 2 mouths instead of 1. In their eyes, she was a loss. Then, from the edge of the group, a hand rose. The movement was small, deliberate. The man who lifted it said nothing, his gaze fixed on the woman in front of him. The auctioneer blinked, uncertain whether he had heard correctly. The bid was barely a whisper against the dust and heat. 6 cents. Not $6. Not 60. 6. A few laughed, thinking it a jest, but the man's face did not change. He repeated himself, calm, steady, as though the number meant something to him that no one else could understand. The auctioneer hesitated, then slammed his hand down on the table, his voice echoing through the yard. Sold. The laughter swelled again, this time louder, mixed with disbelief and mockery. 6 cents for a woman and her unborn child. 6 cents for the weight of 2 lives. The crowd began to disperse, still talking about the absurdity of the price, but the man did not join them. He remained still, eyes steady, watching as she was led toward him. She did not look at him. Her face revealed nothing, no fear, no hope, no understanding. It was as if the moment had already passed her by. She had stood on too many platforms, heard too many voices, seen too many hands raised to be moved by another. When their paths met, she bowed her head slightly, not in gratitude but in acknowledgement of the inevitable. He gestured toward the road, and she followed, her steps slow, her hands resting on the curve of her stomach. Behind them, the sound of the auction continued. More names were called, more lives exchanged. The air filled once more with the rhythm of commerce, as though her sale had been nothing at all, a brief pause in the day's work. But somewhere, between the echo of the auctioneer's hammer and the fading sound of laughter, a truth settled over the crowd. For all the wealth and pride that surrounded them, the value of a human life had just been measured in coins too small to hold meaning. And yet, that moment, insignificant to them, would outlast every man who stood there. She was not born to the land where she now walked. Her first cry had risen from another plantation many miles away, a place where the soil was darker and the work heavier. She had known no mother beyond the shadow that fed and faded before memory could take root. Her earliest years passed in the company of other children who learned quickly what silence meant. They carried water, gathered wood, and watched the field stretch beyond the horizon, never asking where they ended. When she was 12, her name was written into a ledger beside a number and a weight. That day, her childhood was sold. The second plantation was larger, the house towering like a watchtower above the fields. It was there she learned the rhythm of servitude, to speak when called, to move without sound, to lower her gaze when certain eyes turned toward her. The work was endless, but it was not the labor that marked her. It was the nights. Nights when footsteps approached the quarters long after the overseer's bell had fallen silent. Nights when she understood, without words, what was expected of her. She did not tell. She could not. In that world, her body was not her own, and to resist was to vanish. Those who had tried were whispered about in the dark, their names followed by silence. So she endured, and when the first signs of life stirred within her, she hid them as long as she could. But the truth of her body could not be concealed forever. When the mistress saw, she turned away without a word, her silence more dangerous than rage. The child's father was known, though never spoken of. His power filled every corner of that house, and his absence carried as much weight as his presence. To name him would have been to break the fragile order that kept the world standing. Her womb was a battlefield of power and shame. To name the father was to risk her life. To stay silent was to live a lie. She chose silence, for silence was survival. In the months that followed, she worked until her strength failed. Then one morning she was sent away, placed on a wagon with no explanation. The driver handed over a slip of paper at the next town, an order of sale, brief and cold. She did not read it. She knew what it meant. Another plantation, another name, another set of hands to obey. Her world moved not by choice but by trade, each journey erasing what little of her past remained. The child within her grew, and so did her fear. She dreamed of a cradle made of scrap wood, of a place where the child might rest without shame, though she knew such places did not exist for people like her. The road carried her through forests and fields, across rivers that reflected the sky she rarely had time to look at. Somewhere between those miles, she stopped being who she had been and became only what others called her. By the time she reached the auction yard where her price would fall to 6 cents, she was already halfway to forgetting her own voice. There are no records that tell her name, no letters that reveal her thoughts, only faint traces. An old cloth marked with initials, a memory passed down through those who watched her go. Yet in those fragments, a life still breathes. She had once been a daughter, perhaps a friend, perhaps even loved by someone brave enough to remember. But history took more than her freedom, it took the right to be known. And so, she remains what they made of her, a woman whose past was sold away, whose silence carried the weight of truth too dangerous to speak. The negotiation that marked her fate began before her name was even spoken. The auctioneer knew she would bring little interest, so he saved her for the end, when the crowd had grown restless, when buyers' patience thinned and the sun pressed hard upon their shoulders. The best bodies had been sold, the strongest men, the youngest women, the most obedient boys. What remained were the weary, the wounded, and the unwanted. Among them, she stood quietly, her hands folded, her eyes lowered, her body bearing the secret of a child soon to come. When her turn arrived, the auctioneer did not bother with ceremony. He called her forward with a smirk and announced her as he might announce a spoiled harvest. He spoke of her youth, her usefulness in the home, and then, with a gesture toward her belly, the flaw that would follow her into every future. The crowd shifted uneasily, not out of sympathy but out of distaste. They had come to buy labor, not charity. A woman about to give birth was a burden, not an investment. The auctioneer, sensing the hesitation, began to play the crowd, his voice growing loud, half jest, half contempt. "Who will take her?" he called out. "Who will take a woman whose hands can't yet work, whose body already serves another man's legacy?" The laughter that followed was thin and sharp. The few who looked her way did so only to judge how far along she was, to measure how much of her strength had already been claimed by the life within her. At the back of the yard stood a man apart from the rest. His clothes were plain, his boots coated in the red dust of the fields. He was no grand planter, no merchant of wealth. His life was built on small harvests and long days, his ambition measured in what he could hold with his own hands. He had not planned to buy anyone that day. His pockets carried little more than loose change and the memory of debts he had yet to pay. But as the bidding faltered, his gaze settled on the woman no one wanted. The auctioneer, growing impatient, dropped the price again and again, his tone turning harsh. He mocked her silence, her stillness, the very child that should have granted her compassion. Then, when it seemed the sale would fail, the man's hand rose. A murmur swept through the crowd. The auctioneer squinted, unsure he had seen correctly. The offer was so small, it might have been a mistake. 6 cents. The words hung in the air, almost absurd against the noise of the yard. Someone laughed. Another cursed. A few turned to see who would humiliate himself with such a bid. But the man's expression did not change. He met the auctioneer's gaze and repeated it, 6 cents, no more. The yard fell into uneasy silence. For a moment, even the auctioneer hesitated, torn between pride and disbelief. Then, with a shrug, he struck the table with his palm. Sold. The laughter returned, louder this time, a mixture of mockery and disbelief. They laughed at the buyer for wasting even that much, and at the woman for being worth so little. Yet neither of them moved to answer. He paid the coins without a word, his fingers rough against the metal, while she stood motionless, her face unreadable. The crowd drifted away, their amusement already fading into the heat, but something lingered in the air, the faint, uneasy truth of what had just taken place. In that laughter lay the cruel economy of the South, where the value of a human life could fall beneath the cost of a button. The coins that passed between the men that day carried more than their worth. They carried the weight of a world that had forgotten the meaning of value itself. And as she followed her new master away from the yard, her shadow fell across the ground like an unspoken question: what was 6 cents truly worth, the price of her body, or the measure of their shame? The road stretched wide and empty beneath the heat, a ribbon of dust winding through the open country. The cart moved slowly, its wheels creaking beneath the weight of tools and feed sacks. Behind it, she walked, her wrists bound by a length of iron that barely held, the sound of it faint against the wind. There was no guard, no whip, no words between them, just the distance of two lives forced together by a trade neither chose. The auction yard faded behind her, its noise dissolving into the hum of insects and the slow rhythm of her footsteps. Once, she turned back. The hill behind her shimmered in the sunlight, and for a moment, she could still see the outline of the block, the rough wooden platform where she had stood. It looked small now, almost harmless, as if the cruelty of what had happened there could shrink with distance. But in her mind, she left something behind, her voice, her name, the last trace of the woman she had been before the 6 coins changed hands. The land around her stretched without end. Fences ran in straight lines toward the horizon, separating fields of cotton not yet picked and soil too dry to give anything more. The air was heavy with the smell of earth and sweat, of animals grazing somewhere unseen. A crow followed above them for a while, its cry cutting through the quiet. She kept one hand near her belly. The child moved within her, small, sudden motions that reminded her she was not alone. Each step sent a dull ache through her body, but she didn't slow. The man on the cart glanced back once, not out of care but to be sure she was still there. Then he turned away again, his attention on the road ahead. As the miles passed, memory returned like fragments of a dream she could not fully wake from, the whisper of her former master's voice, the smell of his room after dark, the night the door opened and she ceased to belong to herself. She remembered the stillness afterward, the way the moonlight fell across the floorboards, the silent promise that no one would ever speak of it. Now, with every mile, the past walked beside her. It was in the weight of her body, in the silence between her breaths, in the shadow of the man who now claimed her for almost nothing. The road did not end, only curved and continued, through fields that all looked the same. Each mile she walked carried 2 hearts, one made of flesh, the other of fear. The place she was brought to was smaller than the one she had left behind. The fields were modest, the quarters fewer, the fences mended and remended with old wood. It was not a grand estate of white columns or marble steps, but a working farm where the master's own hands bore the proof of his labor. The men here rose with the sun and ended their day with it, the women cooked, washed, mended, and prayed. Life moved slowly, measured not by comfort but by endurance. Her arrival stirred little notice at first. Another face among many, another back to bend beneath the weight of the day. Yet the others watched her quietly, the woman bought for less than a coin's worth of bread, the one whose belly held the child of another man. They whispered in the dark corners of the quarters, wondering why he had bothered to buy her at all. The new master was a man of few words. He did not shout, nor did he strike without reason. His presence was a quiet one, built of long silences and hard work. In the beginning, he kept his distance, speaking to her only when necessary, where to fetch water, how to tend the small garden near the fence, when to rest. Yet there was something in the way he looked at her, not with ownership, but with the weight of a thought he could not name. Days turned into weeks. The fields filled with the noise of planting, the quarters with the soft rhythm of chores and whispered songs. And still, something began to shift. He would ask if she was eating enough, if the child moved. He would pause when she passed, his voice low, uncertain, as though the sound of her silence unsettled him. To the others, it was nothing at first, a man's passing interest in a servant's well-being. But on plantations, nothing stayed hidden for long. Rumors began to take shape like smoke rising from unseen fire. They said he treated her differently, that he spoke to her rather than through her. Some said it was pity, others said guilt. A few believed he saw in her the shadow of his own sins, reflected through a woman he could not forget or forgive. Whatever it was, it did not go unnoticed. The mistress of the house was the first to feel it, the subtle change in his tone, the pauses that lingered too long. She watched from windows, from doorways, from the edge of her own silence. Her eyes followed him when he left, followed the woman when she returned. She asked questions she already knew the answers to, and still, none of them brought her peace. At night, the walls of the small house seemed to hold their breath. The mistress would lie awake, listening for footsteps, for voices, for any sound that could give shape to her suspicion. And though none came, her thoughts grew louder. She began to see the woman's shadow everywhere, in the hallways, in the corners of her mind, in the distance between herself and her husband. In the eyes of the mistress, 6 Cents became a curse, a reminder that cheap things often carry the heaviest burdens. That night, the sky broke open. Rain fell in thick, slanted sheets, drumming against the tin roof of the quarters and drowning the usual hum of the night. The air was heavy, full of the smell of wet earth and iron. In one of the smallest cabins, a single candle flickered against the dark, its light trembling as though it feared what it might reveal. She was alone. The pains had begun before sunset, small and far apart, but by the time the rain came, they had sharpened into something that left her breathless. The others had gone quiet, afraid to intervene, afraid of what might be said if the mistress knew. Someone had fetched water and left it by her side, but no one stayed. Outside, thunder rolled across the fields, steady and cruel, marking the rhythm of her struggle. She gripped the edge of the cot until her knuckles whitened, her breath breaking into shallow gasps. The world outside disappeared, there was only the storm, the candle, and the life inside her fighting to come forth. The walls groaned with the wind, the floor shook with each flash of lightning. She whispered words no one could hear, half prayer, half memory, her voice trembling between pain and defiance. No doctor came. No midwife stayed. Only the walls bore witness as another life entered a world that did not want it. When the child came, the storm seemed to pause, as if the sky itself took a single breath. The baby's cry rose thin and pure against the sound of rain. It was small, fragile, but alive. She gathered the child in her arms, the warmth of new life pressing against her skin. Her lips trembled into a faint smile, tired and broken but real. For the first time in months, she felt the weight inside her replaced by something living, something that belonged to her alone. The door creaked open. She did not move. The figure that stepped inside brought the cold air with him. He stood in the doorway, hat in hand, rainwater dripping from his coat. His eyes fell on the child, and for a long moment, nothing existed but that gaze, the slow, uncertain recognition that passed across his face. The child's features were unmistakable. The curve of the mouth, the tone of the skin, the shadow of a man who was not there. The master's breath caught, and in that silence, the truth became heavier than any storm. He said nothing. Not a word. He turned, his boots sinking into the mud outside, the rain swallowing the sound of his retreat. The door swung halfway closed, the candlelight trembling in his absence. Inside, she lay back, holding the child close. The thunder rolled again, softer now, as though even the storm had grown tired. Her eyes drifted toward the roof where rain still fell in relentless rhythm. She whispered something only the child could hear, a name, a promise, or perhaps just a breath of gratitude that they had both survived the night. Morning returned slowly to the plantation, washing the fields in pale light that softened nothing, only revealed what the night had hidden. The storm had passed, but its memory lingered in the puddles along the road, in the damp earth that clung to her bare feet as she stepped outside, her child wrapped in cloth she had torn from her own dress. The world looked the same, yet something in it had shifted. A new life had entered the silence, and with it, a question no one dared to ask aloud. Days became weeks. The child survived when few expected he would. His cry became part of the rhythm of the quarters, small, persistent, defiant. She worked again before her body had healed, carrying him tied against her back as she moved between the garden and the house. No one told her to rest, no one offered help. Yet the mistress began to call her more often, to clean, to tend, to keep company in the long afternoons when the house felt too empty. The boy grew beneath the uneasy protection of that house. In the fields, the others looked at him with quiet curiosity. His skin was lighter, his eyes sharper, carrying echoes of two men whose names bound him to two worlds that would never meet. Among the field hands, he was tolerated, among the house staff, he was endured. No one dared mistreat him outright, his mother's strange position shielded him in ways no law ever could. She had become both invisible and indispensable. The mistress trusted her more than she realized, leaving the care of small things, linen, keys, letters, in her hands. Yet that trust carried a shadow. The mistress's gaze followed her often, searching for evidence of a betrayal she could not name. Each favor given was also a chain, each word of kindness a test of loyalty. The master spoke less and less. His silence grew into a kind of distance that filled every room he entered. When his eyes met hers, they said nothing, but behind them was the unspoken truth that tied their fates together. The child carried it in his face, the shape of another man's memory, the echo of another master's sin. The years turned quietly. The boy learned to walk, to speak, to laugh, to work. He played at the edge of the fields where no one bothered him. When he ran too close to the main house, someone would call him back with a sharp tone, not of anger but of fear, fear of what he represented. In town, whispers began to spread. They spoke of a woman bought for 6 cents, who bore the child of one man and raised him under another. Some said she was cursed, others said she was blessed. A few, those who still kept records of who owned whom, called her simply the 6-cent woman. Her name faded, replaced by the legend her price had created. She lived between two worlds, too valuable to lose, too human to free. And the boy, as he grew, became more than a child, he became a story that passed from mouth to mouth, a living reminder of everything the South wished to forget, the trade that bought love, the silence that birthed shame, and the price of a woman whose worth could never be counted in coins. History did not remember her name. The ledgers kept by men of ink and power reduced her to a line of faint handwriting, female, late term, purchased for 6 cents. No story followed, no mention of the child who cried through that storm, no trace of the woman who walked miles behind a cart and built a life from the ashes of her own silence. The paper remembered the number, but not the soul it was written upon. The years that came after blurred her existence further. The plantation changed hands, the fields withered, and the house rotted from within. The names of masters were preserved in stone and law, but hers, like the thousands of others, dissolved into dust. And yet, even without a monument or a mark, her story remained, not in books, not in speeches, but in the silence left behind by those who could not speak. Her child grew into a world that never wanted him whole, a world that measured worth by color, by birth, by price. And still, the blood that ran through him carried her quiet defiance, the proof that even the smallest life, bought for less than a loaf of bread, could bear witness to the weight of what was taken. The fields she once walked now lie empty, their soil heavy with the memory of footsteps long vanished. The auction houses stand hollow, their wooden floors echoing with the ghosts of bargains struck in dust and cruelty. The records remain, but they tell only of commerce, never of conscience. But stories like hers shape the silence between the lines of history books, a silence that still speaks of value, ownership, and what it means to be human. In that silence, she lives again, not as property or symbol, but as proof that a life cannot be measured by its price. For 6 cents, a man bought a life. But in that exchange, the world lost a piece of its soul. If this story moved you, share it. Because history's quietest voices deserve to be heard.